Now, speaking of laws and things that pass, a lot of times what happens is there'll be citizens' positions, or citizens will want to put things to vote on, as you said, as we said earlier, like the illegal immigrants we were able to vote on if they got driver's licenses. Didn't go the way we wanted it, but the people got to vote on it. The millionaires tax people got to vote on. And another thing that people got to vote on was Proposition 2.5. And I believe it was in 1980 that that was passed, Proposition 2.5, which basically limited how much they could raise your property tax in a single year.
In this, I believe this just happens on the town level, right? Like,
Correct.
there's no Prop 2.5 on the state level, so this would be in some cases it can be used both for good and bad purposes, I guess. So, for example, in my town, we had a road that was really beat up, and the town was looking to completely repave the road and like redo the road, really extend the road and constructing the road. And obviously, that was a big sum of money that the town didn't have in its operating budget. So they put it to Prop 2.5 for the voters to decide: do we want to spend money on doing this road? And if we do that, we have to pass Prop 2.5, which I think essentially just means your taxes. I mean, is there a definition on like when Prop 2.5 takes effect?
Well, Prop 2.5 has been going on since 1980, and what has to happen is if a town requires an increase on their property higher than 2.5%, the town has to vote on it, like an override of 2.5. I think what happened, it was initially put in place, and I think it's a great idea. And this is just a Boston.com article. And what I think is happening is the state knows that it's not taking as much revenue. We discussed in last week's episode how there's a mass migration out of Massachusetts that keeps happening. We also discussed in that episode that a lot of these people that are leaving aren't poor people, they're people with money and means to leave. So what's happening is we're starting to experience these shortfalls. And then with the pandemic and businesses being able to let people work from home, I think I read an article this week that 20% of real estate that's used for business, for offices or whatever, is going unused in Boston right now. That's unsustainable, because what's eventually going to happen, you're going to have these businesses that what they're going to do is they're going to say, hey, we don't need to rent this property. Our people can work from home. So they're going to pull out. When that happens, they have to start lowering rent. These companies have to lower rent to attract businesses. Well, when they lower rent of their properties, that lowers their property value. And then once their property values start going, then the surrounding properties start losing value. So this is part of what the article was saying too, is that you're going to see this domino effect pretty soon, and local governments, towns aren't going to be able to afford things. And that's where I disagree with this article. Is I think what happened is the politicians for far too long think they could keep going to this slush fund of money, and all this money will always be there. And they're doing the things they want to do, like we discussed in another episode about paying $25,000 per immigrant. They're spending money on all these different programs in colleges and schools. We discussed in an episode how Boston wants to give free tuition to any resident, whether you're here legally or not. So there's all these little nice things they want to do and get rid of money. At the same point in time, because of some of their bad decisions, things getting expensive, the workforce changing where people can work with laptops and not have to go into work. What's happening is the dynamics changing, and the only thing that's not changing is the propensity for politicians to keep wanting to spend. And again, like, this is just another one of those things. We talked last week about one of those bills that was proposed, that they want to allow towns or cities to, when you sell your house or do a property transfer, that they'll be able to charge you a 0.5% up to 2% in a fee. Well, it's not a fee, it's a tax. So what's happening is they just keep looking for these new revenue streams instead of actually doing what they're supposed to do and say, hey, listen, we can't keep spending, because all that's going to do is speed up the process of people leaving. So what we have to do is actually be a good fiduciary of other people's money, like not spend like a drunken sailor. Like, we got to spend, and like you and I have to, right? When we have a house, we have a budget, we have to spend within our means. And I hope this forces them, or if it doesn't force politicians to do it, hopefully it ticks off enough people that they say enough, and there's good people that run that are sick of it, and we can actually change the dynamic of how the state house is running right now.
Yeah, and as we know, it's like the economy works in cycles too, and I think it makes sense when everything is going kind of in a trajectory upward cycle where it's like each year asset values, property values increase a little bit, so the tax revenues increase a little bit, the spending increase a little bit. Everything kind of moves in line. But then what happens is as your property taxes as your property values go up, your taxes, as a percentage should kind of come down to reflect the total. But a lot of these towns, they don't do that. They
No.
charge you 10% or whatever on your property. It doesn't matter if it goes up from, let's say 200,000 to 400,000. The percentage should come down in that situation for them to tax the same amount. But instead, what happens is the overall tax revenues come up, and the
Yes.
towns get used to spending that level of money. And then what happens is that's great in an upward cycle. But once you start to reach these bubbles like we did in 2008, and if there's a recession, we could be in one right now,
Yep.
all of a sudden you start to see the asset and property values start to come down. And then the towns are already used to spending this level. They're already used to this higher level of spending. And I think that's why we saw the state reach a deficit in April, because as stock gains, capital gains are not as high as they were last year. As property values start to come down, a lot less revenue starts coming into the state, and then all of a sudden, these because they're used to budgeting at these high rates, now all of a sudden there's a huge gap in the budget that they were not expecting.
Yeah, so let me read some. I'm going to jump around this article because this article seems way out of order for how I would I would have wrote it. But I'm going to jump around a little bit and then we can discuss just a little bit longer. So Proposition 2.5 is the product of a 1980 statewide ballot initiative after years of hefty inflation in the 1970s. The measure limits how much property tax revenue a community can raise via property taxes. The measure states property tax revenues can't increase more than 2.5% annually without an override majority vote. So, like I said, the town has to come together. There has to be a vote. What they do is they put the kids out there that are going to not have band, not have sports. They use these kids as political tools all the time. And, oh, this, you're not going to have a football team and they're not going to have music unless you do this. So, pisses people off. And then they have to vote against their thing. And no one ever puts out the politicians that made these bad policies and be like, hey, why don't we just hold these people to account, right? So another thing in this article says plugging the gap means looking for new income streams and perhaps revisiting a more than 40-year-old statute that limits how much property tax and local governments can collect. And then there's this guy, a real estate attorney and former Boston City Council president, who says there will be lots of 2.5 overrides in the suburbs. They know because their prescription for their mismanagement isn't to stop mismanaging, is to just keep raising money. Right? Spend, baby, spend, I guess.
Well, yeah, and it's like, I mean, this isn't rocket science, right? So it's putting together a budget. Anyone has to do this, whether you're in a household or you're in a company, and it's like in good times, that's when you want to be putting money away. So
Hmm.
that's when you want to be putting money into like a slush fund or something, so you have it for the future. Like, if you have projects,
What's
you kind of structure your money responsibly, so you have like money to spend on it. Where
Jimmy? What's putting money away for the government? Are you kidding me?
I know. It's like, yeah, I love it when someone I was talking to was talking about this too, where the town wanted to do Prop 2.5 for something. It was for like, I don't know, salary increases or something, and the town ended up shutting it down. And they said, no, we don't want to increase people's taxes to fund this. And then all of a sudden, the town was like, oh well, we found this money in our rainy day fund, so we'll actually fund it with this other money instead. And he's like, well, wait a second, if you had this other money sitting on the side, why were you asking people
Yeah.
for higher taxes in the first place? And that's, I think, the kind of games that happen with this stuff, unfortunately.
In this article, it talks about the town of Newton, and the voters actually voted this year and declined a Proposition 2.5 override. Because there was a school funding gap. But it goes on to tell you in 2002 and in 2013, they had passed Proposition 2.5 overrides. So I'm glad the town did it. I'm glad the town didn't fall into this, oh, we're gonna lose all this other stuff. But I'm sure there was people pissed at other people on both sides, and were ticked at the wrong people. You know, you have a lot of people retired, fixed income, elderly, don't make a lot of money, and they're just trying to scrape by. And again, because of school, like a school should know, hey, if we're only gonna get 2.5% a year, this is how we manage it. But it seems like every 4, 6, 8 years, all of a sudden, like, well, we're coming up short. And we discussed this, I think, in last week's episode too. We discussed how in the 1950s, schools had more activities for kids to do. I looked, like I said, I used to look back at my mother's yearbook and like, look at all these silly activities. Now there's less and less activities, and we've paid more and more for things. So we're basically getting less for our dollar. So I think what has to happen is that this article to me is just to get people in the mindset that it's coming, and they're gonna blame everything except what needs to be blamed. They're gonna blame the recession. They're gonna blame, the laptop class. They're gonna blame greedy business owners. They're gonna blame everything except the tax and spend politicians who are spending 25,000 per immigrant here, and or they're spending, like I said, all this foolish money on all these, social justice programs that they wanna do. And I don't even care, like, even if it's not a social justice thing, like, just money that could go to something better, right? Like, I don't care if there's something that I want and the government does, and they say we're going to take money. Good, take the money, use it properly, fund what needs to be fun. Like, there should just be a base, right? Like, you should at least be able to take care of these things. But we can't even take care of the homeless now. We can't take care of veterans. We can't take care of the elderly. But man, we can sure take care of a lot of other things that doesn't make a difference. So
And 9 times out of 10, this spending is really just kicking the can down the road, because it's just a way for them to fund a project that, like, they don't really have a real solution towards in terms of balancing the budget. So a lot of times it's just really making the decision that they're going to have to make later down the road even worse. And like we know with all this stuff, it's great when you can keep increasing taxes, but eventually at some point, the music stops, and
yes.
that's when you have to kind of, I guess, stop and face the music.
Yeah. I think a lot of the politicians at that point just like, well, they won't run, and they don't have to take the heat. And maybe that's maybe, talking about those bills in the last part of this last segment, is maybe what some bills should be is like put politicians on the hook for their bad decisions. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Like, I'm on the hook if I make bad decisions. Maybe they should be on the hook because one of their duties is to be fiscally responsible, and they're anything but. So maybe there should be some laws that, hey, if you're not fiscally responsible, you're gonna have to pay too. I think that would cover some things. But again, we're not big into bills, and that leads to the next